Good morning. Sunday, May 3rd. I can't believe it's already May. But here we are. We are in our second week of kind of looking into popular verses that are ones that we probably need to take a little more context into. And so we started last week with Philippians 4:13. It says, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And you can see on the slide what we're going to talk about today, which is Romans 8, verse 28. But with these verses, they seem like verses, especially like last week, Philippians 4:13, that calls us to find strength when we need to pass a test or when we need to do well at a sport. But like we talked about last week, a better understanding of that verse is that God is calling us to contentment in every circumstance that we face, whether good or bad. So this morning we're looking at Romans 8:28. And it says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Now, why is this verse so popular? What does it say to you? It speaks to our fears. It lets you know that God is with you. This verse is sometimes used to say, in a sense, sort of, smile your cares away. Everything's going to be fine. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's called the Pollyanna Principle. And it's a novel, a book about a girl who plays the glad game. So basically what it is just finding something happy in every situation, good or bad. So according to this principle, this Pollyanna principle, the brain processes information that is pleasing and agreeable in a more precise and exact manner as compared to unpleasant information. And you can find more about this on the Pollyanna Principle Wikipedia page. I'll have that link in the description box. But do all things really work for good? I'm going to talk about that here in just a few minutes, but taking this verse, Romans 8:28, out of context can cause us to really minimize tragedy. And I hope that we don't minimize pain and suffering. This verse, Romans 8:28, is very popular to quote to somebody who's going through something difficult. And I hope that we don't just throw this verse at people who are suffering, who are going through terrible things. You think about the story of, Lazarus' death. Jesus wept at Lazarus' death, but he also knew that his friend would soon be raised from the dead. So you might be thinking, well, if he knew that, then why did he weep? He cried for Mary and Martha. Jesus taught us to weep with those who weep. I'm guilty of this, and I know that there are other parents who are probably just as guilty as this, but sometimes, we'll tell our kids, just shake it off whenever they get hurt. This verse sometimes is almost like a spiritual shake off, like something happens like, oh, it's okay. And then we quote this, Romans 8:28. And most of the time when we talk about, standalone Bible verses, we kind of uncover that the verse doesn't mean what we think it means. Or, we tell you that the verse is taken out of context. But with this verse, I'm going to kind of show you that it means those things, but it also means so much more. A lot of times we really sell, especially this verse, short. Just like last week, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. Paul wrote the letter to the Romans from the city of Corinth while he was on his third missionary journey. And at that time, he was, gathering an offering from the Gentile Christians for the church in Jerusalem. And this is around 56 AD. And so to all in Rome who are loved by God and called to be saints, like his intent was for the Christians in all of Rome to read this letter. And you might be thinking, well, why just the Christians? Corinth was an ancient Greek city which was very important from the earliest times, but it was severely defeated by the Romans in about 146 BC. Corinth was officially founded by the Roman Empire under the rule of Julius Caesar. Now, why did Paul write this letter? Salvation has been provided by God through Jesus Christ, which must be received by faith, and to work out your faith in practical ways. Jewish believers in Rome still felt constrained to observe the older religious laws. The letter was also written to encourage Christian unity and passion for evangelism and missions. So I want to look at the surrounding verses to kind of get a bigger picture. So I'm going to read Romans chapter 8. I'm going to start in verse 18, and I'm going to read down to verse 30. You're going to see verses 18 to 27 on the screen. So I'll read to verse 27, I'll pause, and then I'll read 28 to 30. It says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved, but hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And He who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. And now I'm going to read 28 to 30. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. For those God foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, that He might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those He predestined, He also called. Those He called, He also justified. Those He justified, He also glorified. So in the previous verses leading up to verse 28, Paul is telling us that our present sufferings aren't worth comparing to God's glory, and that we're going to be free from bondage. The truth about this meaning of this verse, it's about God's plan for eternity. God has an eternal purpose. You see this in Job 42:2, and this is up on the screen as well. I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You even think about the most evil thing that has ever happened, and you can see it in Acts 4:27. Indeed, Herod and Pontius Pilate met together with the Gentiles and the people of Israel in this city to conspire against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed. That was all part of God's plan. This verse, Romans 8:28, isn't about our individual trials. It does provide comfort that God is eternal. Nothing can take away our greatest treasure, that God's love for us expressed through the cross by His grace. God can use all things, including verse 18. Sufferings we face, here and now, to teach us not to trust in ourselves. God can even use our sin to teach us this. Has sin ever worked out for anyone's good? God gives us these rules, but we break them, and then we wonder where God is. He can use our sin to teach us to trust him. This verse isn't telling us to pretend that heartaches are good, or death, or loneliness, or abandonment, but God can use these trials to teach us grace and love in ways that we probably have never known. God's eternal purpose is that we are to become conformed into the image of his Son. Like, he has predestined that, and nothing can change it. There's a story I remember hearing about several years ago, but her name was Joni Erickson Tada. So she was out swimming in a lake with some friends, and not really knowing how shallow that part of the lake was, she dove in head first. She broke her neck, and she became quadriplegic. And so there is a website. I'll try to find it. The one that I have the link to is no longer available, but she has a very powerful story. So I'll give you the website that'll work for you to be able to see that. That'll be in the description box. And so you can take a further look at that. But when we go through trials and suffering, what are we going to do with them? Do you believe that God is working your trials together for your ultimate good and for those he's calling you to serve? It's very popular to interpret good as comfort and wealth. But the good spoken of the next verse is about conformity to Christ. If we look at good as what we only see on this life on earth, we are missing the point of Romans 8:28. Christ paid the ultimate price. And in order to become like Christ, we have to endure suffering and trust God through that. So I don't know if you remember the question from the beginning, but do all things really work together for good? And I ask that question because I think our version of good and God's version of good are not always the same version. Because good to us could just be being happy. Good to God means being holy, being set apart, being righteous. So the phrase work together is really one word. It's synergos in Greek. It's where we get the word synergy from. When you put two or more elements together to form something brand new that neither could form on their own. God works out all things, even the bad things in our lives, in order to connect us with his Spirit and to make us brand new. The experiences in our life are designed to work together to build us into the image of Christ. The things that we're going through, I'm going to close with this, but the things that we're going through right now, yes, are not fun, but we have the ultimate chance to not only grow in our relationship with God, but to be, basically be Jesus to those who, we will eventually come back into contact with, those that might be struggling with this right now. We have that chance to be Christ to them, to be that image of Christ for them. So we still have a job to do. And I hope that you guys are inspired by that. I hope that, we understand that, yes, we are loved, but we are also called to love. I look forward to next week. Next week we are looking at Jeremiah 29:11, another very popular verse. We'll kind of dissect that a little bit and talk about it more. So I hope that you'll join us next week. Be on the lookout for daily devotionals this next week as well on our YouTube page or Facebook page. So it'll be on social media. So just be on the lookout for that. So I hope that you have a great day. I love you guys, and I'll see you